Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to hit like and subscribe as well so that you can watch future videos also. So today what we're going to be talking about is we're going to dive into some questions I've had fairly frequently from some of my New Zealand viewers, and that is around what is the best broker to use. So if you're just getting started in investing, should you go with one of the banks? Should you go with one of the new discount sort of online brokers? What's got the best fees? What's the easiest to use? All those kinds of questions. So I've got a bit of personal experience using a couple of different brokers now, so I'm going to dive into that and run you through the different options and my opinion on what I have used so far. So let's get into it. So when it comes to buying shares from New Zealand and picking out a broker, there's really a couple of different categories that you've got to kind of stick brokers into, in my opinion, and that is all revolving around what country and what exchange you want to buy shares on. So for buying shares from New Zealand, I'm assuming that there's probably a few different exchanges you probably want to be buying shares on. The first one is obviously the NZX, the New Zealand Exchange. I'm guessing if you're based in New Zealand, you want to be buying New Zealand companies, and I think that's great. So that's going to be the first sort of broker category that we kind of look into. Most of the brokers in that category also offer ASX trading, or the Australian Stock Exchange, which I'm guessing is probably second or third on your list. And the other one that I'm guessing you also probably want to be looking fairly closely at is the US market. So companies listed on the NASDAQ and in the S&P 500 and that sort of thing. And the companies or the brokers that work in the US are going to be in quite a different category here. So although some of your New Zealand and Australian brokers will offer international share trading outside of those two countries, the fees often ramp up quite dramatically, and that is one of the reasons that I actually now work with a couple of different brokers. So I work with one broker for sort of New Zealand and Australia, and I work with one just for the US alone. So let's get into that. Let's go through some of the different fees and some of the kind of user interface and how you actually go about buying shares with these different brokers. And I'll get into my opinion on what I think's best and what's easiest to use and all that kind of stuff. So let's get into it. So first off, let's talk about buying shares in New Zealand and Australia, and I'm going to talk specifically about buying shares in individual companies. So one of the companies that's become quite popular recently is Securities. They have very low fees and they offer very small amounts of money. You can put in very small amounts of money and invest it. But predominantly that is just investing in ETFs and index funds, at least at this point. I know they have been putting out some feelers for kind of what people would want to do in terms of investing in individual companies. But for now, as far as I'm aware, at least, it's just ETFs and index funds. So we're not going to talk too much about Securities today. We're going to talk about the individual kind of company brokers. And the first one I'm going to talk about is ASB Securities. So ASB Securities is the first broker that I ever started with, and it's the one I'm still with in terms of New Zealand and Australian exchanges. So just to run you through the fees, when I first started, basically all brokerage under $10,000 was basically 30 New Zealand dollars a trade. Over and above $10,000 is 0.3%, so still at that $10,000 threshold, you're talking $30 per transaction. But over and above that, you'll start to continue to pay sort of 0.3% from there. So couple of things that come along with that. They've recently changed to offer $15 brokerage if the trade is under $1,000. So for people really just getting started, that's a big plus. And it means that in terms of trying to get those fees down as a percentage of the amount of money you're investing, there's a bit of incentive there to try and get up close to the $10,000 mark and get those bigger trades kind of coming through. So what you don't want to do, obviously, is invest a whole lot of money and have a big percentage of it go to fees. So if you invest, say, $1,000 and 5% of that is going to fees, that's $50. And then when you sell, you've also got 5% going to fees, so you're down $100 or about 10% before you even get started. So keeping fees low is very important. The other thing that comes along with brokers in general is you obviously want something secure. You're putting your hard-earned money into these shares, into these businesses, so you don't want something too dodgy. You want to have something reliable and safe, and something like ASB, you can literally walk into a branch if you've got any burning questions. You can also call and email and do all that kind of stuff. So ASB is the one that I continue to use for New Zealand and Australia. If Sharesies or someone comes along with a lot lower brokerage costs even than that, I may kind of flip across, but ASB is the broker that I'm working with at the moment. So that's ASB in terms of fees. Just in regards to the actual user interface and what it's like to sort of go through the process of putting in an order to buy or sell shares, in New Zealand and Australia at least, it's pretty straightforward. So essentially you go onto the ASB website, you enter the security that you want to buy. So if you want to buy shares in, say, the A2 Milk Company, then you'd put the ticker ATM and pick the New Zealand exchange. You then put in the amount of shares you want to buy, the price you're willing to pay, and essentially go through the order from there. And you can do this all online. And they've got email notifications for when that trade actually goes through and processes and things as well. So that's really easy. One of the things that I did find tricky in terms of ASB was when it got to international orders. So that's what we'll talk about next. Let's talk about some international brokers and some different options you've kind of got there. So in terms of buying and selling shares outside of New Zealand and Australia, I'm assuming that most of the time you're probably going to be looking at the US. They have one of the largest stock markets in the world, some of the best known companies in the world, and it's a place that has performed very well in the past in terms of the returns back to investors. So that is the next exchange we're going to talk about. And just sticking with ASB first of all, I have actually placed a US sort of trade with ASB before. And there were a couple of things that I really did not like with that kind of service through ASB. And it's a reason why I have switched over to a new company actually called Hatch Invest, which you may or may not be familiar with. And people that may have had different experiences to me, this is just sort of my opinion. But with ASB, the first thing that you'll notice when you go to place an international order is, well, there's three things really. There's three things I didn't like. So the first one is there is no online brokerage service for buying shares in the US. The first thing you have to do is you actually have to get on the phone and call the broker. And that leads to sort of my second issue, which is it really ramps up the fees. So when you place a trade online, for New Zealand and Australia, you're talking $15 to $30 depending on the amount of money you invest, maybe slightly more if you put in sort of a big trade north of $10,000 at once, but that's typically the kind of range you're sitting in. Now when you go to invest in the States and you put in a phone order, you're looking at 90 US dollars, in other words around 130-ish New Zealand dollars just to put a trade through. So to have that make sense in terms of not taking up a big percentage of the total capital you're trying to invest, you have to have a reasonable amount of money to make that work. It's not really set up all that well for small investors, and you got to get on the phone and you got to pay big fees. The third thing that comes along with that is I found that the exchange rate wasn't great. It wasn't anywhere near as good as Hatch Invest, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. From personal experience, I transferred across around 7,000 New Zealand dollars into a US currency through ASB. And, you know, comparing that against the exchange rate I was looking at online and the exchange rate I got through ASB, they basically clipped the ticket at roughly around $250. I was kind of worse off from making that exchange. So there are a few negatives there, and that's kind of my personal experience with ASB Securities in terms of their international trading. Again, just my opinion. People may have had great experiences, but that's kind of where I'm sitting with ASB. So that's some negatives on the sort of international side with them, on the US side at least. I still continue to use them for New Zealand and Australia. I found them really good for that. So without further ado, let's get into Hatch Invest and talk about my new broker with the US. Okay, so Hatch Invest is a relatively new company. They are backed by Kiwi Wealth, which is involved in our sort of superannuation KiwiSaver kind of schemes here in New Zealand, and they have a couple of big benefits for smaller kind of individual investors wanting to get into the US market. So they are a relatively new online platform. You can make all of your orders online. You don't have to get on the phone like you do with other brokers. This is also not a sponsored video by Hatch or anything like that, just in case you're thinking that. Just thought I'd throw that in there. But essentially you can make your orders online. The exchange rate is a lot lower, so well under 1% of basically that's how much they're clipping the ticket when you convert New Zealand dollars to US dollars. So there's a much more beneficial exchange rate for investors. And the fees are also very, very low. So with ASB, like we were talking before, you're looking at 90 US dollars a trade. Whereas with Hatch, you're looking at a maximum of about 8 US dollars per trade, unless you're buying a quite large number of shares. So from anywhere between 1 share and 400 shares in a company, you're looking at 8 US dollars per trade. So if you even wanted to invest 400 shares of Amazon and you're investing, $600,000 or $800,000 US dollars, you're still looking at 8 US dollars per trade. So that's ridiculously low exchange rate. That is fantastic. Less than 10% of what we were working with ASB. Plus, we have more money to actually funnel into the markets because of that better exchange rate. So, a couple of big pluses there for individual investors, and that is fantastic. One of the other things that we also get is our tax can be processed through Hatch for 50 cents a year. Another big bonus. That's pretty hard to beat. And the other thing that you get is you also have any dividends and any cash sitting in that Hatch account automatically invested in a money market fund. And if you don't know what a money market fund is, essentially it's a type of fund where you will earn savings accounts type kind of levels of return. So it's basically a bit of a placeholder for any cash that you've got sitting in that account. And one of the things I actually didn't mention with the ASB Securities brokerage before is I don't actually have my sort of regular savings and checking accounts and things like that with ASB. I bank with Westpac typically. So anytime I wanted to invest through ASB Securities, I would transfer that money across. Just because the typical securities sort of brokerage accounts don't actually have any interest rate on them. So if you have cash sitting there, it's not generating any sort of return at all. I'm sure it's easy enough to probably open up a high interest savings account with ASB as well, but it's just something I never did. So I had that sitting in ASB, so I had that sitting in Westpac and I transferred it across. That was a bit of a pain when I was working with international currencies, because if I got paid an Australian dividend or a US dividend, for example, if I wanted to earn interest on that cash while it was just sitting there and not invested, I'd again have to transfer it across to New Zealand dollars, paying an exchange rate fee again, and then back into my Westpac account. So there are a few kind of extra steps that I have to take there. With Hatch, I get paid a dividend, it goes straight into that US money market account. It always stays in US dollars, and I'm not having to pay fees to constantly go back and forth between New Zealand and US currencies. So that is a big plus for me and something I really like. And that's the reason I'm using Hatch Invest for my international trading. So there you have it. That's my sort of background and my kind of opinion on the best brokers to use for New Zealand investors. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do have any questions or comments, definitely drop them down below. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely hit like, definitely hit subscribe. There's a subscribe button, I think, over here somewhere, and watch some other videos over that way. And I'm pretty sure I just got that backwards again, but whatever direction it is. Cheers. Have a great day.